Hello and welcome everyone. In this video I want to show you my list of Minion League starters for Necropolis. I initially aimed for a selection of 5 builds, until I realized that I didn't feature a single permanent Minion build. Since Spectres are weak on League start due to the small number of maximum Spectres, and Carrion Golems are past their prime, I decided to go with Stone Golems. They have decent clear as long as you scale AoE, and are pretty much unkillable once you start using cold iron points in the low budget. The main drawback is the dependency on primordial gems, and the transfigured version to be effective. Sadly, this is a general trend with minion builds these days. Most of them have to be leveled as either Absolution or SRS, because the other options are either too weak, too slow, or both. There are passive tree progressions and campaign skill guides for all builds in the PoEs. Since they're pretty much cookie cutter, I won't go into further details, save for 1 or 2 builds. For the Stone Golem Necromancer, I recommend playing SRS until you can get at least 2 Clay Shapers and the Transfigured gem, Stone Golem of the Hordes. It's even better to wait until you've managed to farm 3 Primordial Harmonies, in addition to the aforementioned items, so your golems can permaslam. They can either be traded for or target farmed via the divination card the Primordial, whereas the Transfigured gem can be bought or accessed via the lab. In terms of gear, we're looking for rares with life, resistances, and attributes. You can throw in Skullhead for additional minion survivability early on, or go with a rare helmet with life and resistances for player defenses. The Jinx Juju helps mitigate hit-based damage, and should be anointed with Dark Arts for additional block chance. For the flasks, you want to get a Life Flask that removes bleeding and corrupted blood, Roomies for armor and block chance, a Quicksilver Flask for movement speed, a Basalt Flask for even more armor, and an Amethyst Flask with an appropriate suffix to protect yourself from chaos damage and ignites. The initial jewels should feature life and minion damage, and should be replaced with the primordial jewels as soon as possible. In addition to that, the low budget features cold iron points instead of clay shapers, and you should also use a proper minion helmet with +2 levels, and a Stygian Vice plus a Ghastly Eye jewel instead of the heavy build. For the Spectres, you want to use a Carnage Chieftain for frenzy charges, and 2 Demon Harpies for the debuff. The Animate Guardian should have Relentless Fury for Culling Strike, Leercast for increased minion damage, Wake of Destruction for Shock Ground, Hunter Influence Gloves for Intimidation, and a combination of Xandathis' Cassock and Broken Faith so a Guardian can create Profane Ground. Next up on my list is Elemental SRS on the Guardian. A tried and tested build that has suffered a bit in the last 2 leagues due to the nerfs to SRS, but it's still pretty strong and unlike many other builds, does not require an auxiliary leveling setup because you can access SRS at the beginning of Act 1. I was a bit torn between this version and the Poison variant on the Necromancer, but decided to recommend the Elemental version on the Guardian because it's less reliant on gear early on, and even though the Sentinel of Radiance was nerfed in 3.24, it still speeds up the campaign significantly. The build has great single target damage and decent clear with melee splash, but requires you to constantly resummon your minions due to the short duration of the spirits. To facilitate this, we're using Unleash support as well as Eldritch Battery. Another thing to look out for is the AoE of the auras from the elemental relics. To make sure that the uptime is as high as possible, you need to stay close to your targets, so off-screening enemies comes with a reduction in DPS. In order to get the attack and spell block chance from Bastion of Hope, you'll have to use an attack and a cast every 4 seconds, which is why you need to use shield charge frequently, even if you otherwise wouldn't want to move around. A major advantage of this build is the high player survivability, because you only take 80% of damage from hits while your Sentinel of Radiance is active. The spirits also constantly heal your other minions whenever they die or the duration runs out due to this minion mastery, which makes survivability of your utility minions an afterthought. The gear is somewhat similar to the build before, but should feature a Convoking Wand rolled with Deafening or Shrieking Essence of Fear, and a Shaper or Warlord influenced shield with percentage-based life recovery on block. The amulet can be anointed with something to scale player survivability, like Juggernaut, because Decay Ward isn't really necessary. The flasks are the same, and for the jewels you want Ghastly Eye jewels with lots of flat added damage. More expensive gear should feature a better shield like the Surrender, a minion helmet with +2 levels, the Flesh Crafter as a body armor, which also allows you to switch from Elemental Weakness to Assassin's Mark, and of course, a Stygian Vice socketed with a Ghastly Eye Jewel. For the Spectres, I recommend an Arena Master for the buff, a Pale Seraphim for the debuff, and a Baronite Cleric for the Fistus Extra Lightning Aura, which is currently not supported in PoE. The Animate Guardian features the same helmet, weapon, and gloves as before, but should use different items in the other positions, like Ice Tomb, Rainbow Stride, and a Crusader-influenced shield with energy shield recovery on block. The other elemental build on the Guardian that is worth taking a look at is Absolution. Just like SRS, the gem can be accessed in the first act, and is thus pretty straightforward when it comes to leveling. The skill is ranged, and has a hit-based component that deals damage, and afflicts enemies with a debuff that transforms their corpses into a Sentinel of Absolution if killed within a second. In addition to that, the skill also has a 25% chance to summon a Sentinel when hitting a rare or unique enemy, which enables bossing with this build. The Sentinels are ranged minions with a small AoE and a limited duration that can be refreshed by triggering the summoning when you already have 3 Sentinels. There's also a Val version of the skill that allows you to ascend one of your Sentinels, which deals 200% more damage, takes 70% less damage, and has abilities with a huge area of effect. This increases clear speed significantly whenever the Ascended Sentinel is active. Sadly, the soul gain prevention timer is rather large, but is an added benefit nonetheless. Since the mana cost of the ability is rather high, you have to use Eldritch Battery for this build as well, but unlike SRS, Absolution doesn't need any auxiliary support gems for mapping. The limited range of the Relic's auras are more manageable here, because the minions are ranged and can be convocated to your position if necessary. The gear is pretty similar, the only difference in regards to the player are the gloves. I personally like using Grip of the Council in this build, because it's dirt cheap, scales minion damage, and unlike SRS, the reduced movement speed doesn't affect the Sentinels much. The jewels should be Cobalt Jewels with increased life and minion damage. For the Spectres, I recommend Carnage and Host Chieftain for the charges, and an Arena Master for the buff. The AG is almost the exact same, except for the gloves. For Absolution, you want the chance to unnerve enemies. The last Guardian build I like to present to you is Dominating Blow. The build has to be leveled as Absolution or SRS until you can access the skill gem in Act 3. The skill is similar in function to Absolution, but instead of a ranged spell, it's a melee attack. The maximum amount of normal Sentinels of Dominance is 9, whereas the Val version can hold 3 charges and allows you to ascend up to 3 Sentinels instead of just 1. The regular Sentinels have a melee attack, use Shield Charge to close the gap, and can use a powerful slam that has a 5-second cooldown. In addition to the 9 normal Sentinels, you can also have 3 magic and 1 rare Sentinel while doing map-like content. These Sentinels will inherit the modifiers from the enemies they are spawned from, including powerful mods like Auras or Soul Eater. If that wasn't enough, you can use the Behead support gem, which grants more damage against enemies on low life, and allows the minion that dealt the killing blow to gain 1 modifier from a rare enemy for 20 seconds, which can also be refreshed by killing more enemies. This is even more relevant for the Ascendant Sentinels because they take 70% less damage, deal 200% more damage, and have powerful AoE abilities. The Val skill always ascends the rare Sentinel first, followed by the magic Sentinels, and only in the absence of those will it choose normal ones. They also inherit the modifier from the Sentinel before the ascension, which in combination with the mod granted from Behead support will significantly increase clear speed and even boss kills in map-like content. The Ascendant Sentinels have a base duration of 30 seconds and can be refreshed by using Val Domination again, which is possible due to the lower soul gain prevention timer compared to Val Absolution. I recommend the physical instead of the elemental version, because unlike SRS, the Sentinels of Dominance don't scale well with flat added damage, which is what you're mostly getting from the elemental relics for attack-based minions. Since you're constantly hitting enemies, you can make use of Holy Relic, which will grant you and your minions additional life regen. This also allows you to use the Scourge, which is a great starting unique for minion builds that require melee weapons to function. Outside of that, the gear is pretty similar to the last build. For the low budget, I recommend Marta's Teaching, because it scales minion damage while also enabling attack skills, and of course you don't need the Fleshcrafter here. The Spectres and the AG are the exact same as they were on the Stone Golem Necromancer. Next up is my league starter from last league, Chaos Ranged Animate Weapon. I had a blast playing it in 3.23, and while it still has some of the issues melee Animate Weapon builds have, the clear speed is so amazing that it doesn't even require an Explodey Animate Guardian setup. Unlike most other ranged minions, it has a long duration, great clear speed, high single target damage, an incredibly aggressive AI, and the minions can be convocated to your positions. The drawbacks are the 2-button playstyle. You need to use Bladefall to generate lingering blades that are then animated by the skill gem, and the fact that the weapons despawn on loading screens, including death. If you choose to play this build, you will have to level this as something else like SRS or Absolution early on. The ability to play Animate Weapon from the get-go, while never the greatest option, has been completely gutted in 3.23, because the base version of Ethereal Knives no longer generates lingering blades. While you can pick up Bladefall from Siosa in Act 3, I heavily recommend switching at the end of Act 4, because this is when you get to access Unleash support, which speeds up the summoning process significantly. In general, I tend to use Unleash support in the campaign, and for fast-paced content like Breach, whereas for bossing or static encounters like Blight, an additional damage support gem is usually preferable. The skill gem we want to use is the Transfigure Gem Animate Weapon of Ranged Arms, which can be accessed via the lab or bought from trade. Until then, you'll have to make do with the melee version. The changes to Unholy Might that are introduced in 3.24 help out early on because all of the minions' physical damage is converted to chaos damage, and it also gives you access to Wither without having to use Withering Touch as a support gem. In the low budget, where you should use Severed in Sleep for level 25 Envy and Crit Strike multi, this is less relevant. You optimally want to use a 4-white Tri-Grip for chaos conversion, and then replace Unnatural Strength with Bone Barrier. Sadly, the 4-white Tri-Grip is going to be more expensive this league due to the removal of the Voragy Crafting Bench, so this won't be possible in the low budget anymore. 4-white Tri-Grips are still accessible through double corruptions in the Temple of Hatsuatl, Vaal Vessels in the Vaal Temple map, and via a combination of Omens of Blanching and Vaal Orbs. However, since all of these options are a bit pricey, the item is now more appropriate for the medium or high budget. The other main difference to the gear featured before is Dendrobait. Optimally, you would like to use Lion Eyes Vision, but since it takes around 500 chromatic orbs to get the 3 green, 3 blue sockets that we need, I'm not comfortable putting this into a low budget build. For the Spectres, I recommend a Carnage and Host Chieftain for the charges, and an Arena Master for the buff. The Animate Guardian is the same as it was on the Stone Golem Necromancer and the Dominating Blow Guardian. And last but not least, there is Physical Armor on the Necromancer. The skill gem used here is Blink Arrow of Bombarding Clones, which summons minions that use a monster version of Rain of Arrows, which makes the build fast, have great clear speed, and decent single target damage. It's a rather strange minion since it uses your bow and quiver, and thus plays like a bow minion hybrid. Unlike Animate Weapon, it can quickly resummon its active minions, so it has a much easier time doing things like Sanctum or re-entering boss fights after dying. Now this isn't true armor because we're only using the Blink Arrow of Bombarding Clones, since they share the same maximum number of clones with the corresponding Transfigured Mirror Arrow gem, and a shared 5-link setup would thus be useless. You want to use the Blink Arrow version because it can also be used as a movement skill, which allows you to quickly traverse large distances, as long as you scale down its cooldown. You want to do this not just for mobility, but mainly to keep fresh meat support active at all times, because it's a rather large boost in DPS. In addition to that, you also need to increase minion duration, which we do via Enduring Bond and Mistress of Sacrifice. The easiest way to reduce the cooldown early on is with this Bow Mastery. For the Necromancer, this is a bit awkward because we have to travel all the way down to this bow cluster since there aren't any near the starting location. We also have to pick up some aura and spell suppression nodes, including Mage Bane, since this build is not using block as a layer of defense. Instead, it utilizes evasion and spell suppression, which we mostly get from the tree early on. The evasion mostly comes from Grace, which we use in combination with Purity of Elements to get immunity against elemental ailments. In order to fit the defensive as well as some offensive auras, you need a lot of reservation efficiency and a Divine Blessing setup for Pride. This requires Eldritch Battery and around 750 energy shield or so to work. Since spamming Blink Arrow is quite resource intensive, this also solves your mana issues in one fell swoop. You might have noticed that I haven't talked about the leveling setup yet, and that's because it's a bit more complicated than for the other builds, and therefore deserves a more in-depth explanation. Like some of the earlier builds, it also requires you to level as either SRS or Absolution early on, and switch once you manage to procure the Transfigure gem via lab or trade. The dexterity requirements for the gem are much higher than what you would get by progressing naturally through the passive tree, so you're going to have to allocate some dexterity nodes, in addition to using items with added dexterity, like a Jade Amulet. Since you don't really need the dexterity nodes for the initial leveling build, I've split up the leveling tree. Switching between the different trees requires a minimal amount of passive refunds, which are covered by the campaign rewards. The same is also true for the campaign skill guide. I've left a full leveling setup with SRS for the entire campaign, in case you don't get Blink Arrow of Bombarding Clones early on, and another one once you procure the Transfigure gem. The first two acts are only relevant for people who start out with the gem and don't play this on League Start. For everyone else, Act 3 is pretty much the earliest you can switch over. Keep in mind that you need a bow and a quiver when switching from SRS to Blink Arrow of Bombarding Clones, so start picking up rare bows and quivers in Act 2 and onward. For the quiver you want added damage and life, whereas the bow should have as much combined physical, elemental and chaos damage as possible. Having a mediocre versus a powerful bow is the difference between having an okayish and a great League Start, so don't underestimate the importance of frequently upgrading your weapon. You can have up to 3 clones that hit single targets between 3 and 4 times, and the easiest way of calculating this is by simply putting 9 clones into PoE. The smaller the AoE, the more hits you get, so concentrated effect is mandatory for single target damage. We're starting out with 2 5-links early on, one for your Blink Arrow of Bombarding Clones, and the other for your utility minions. For the League Start gear, a 5-link bow with a decent physical damage like Chinsol will do. The quiver should feature damage and alive. The rest of the gear is somewhat comparable to the other builds. However, it's important to note that all of the items have to be evasion based to activate this evasion mastery for the spell suppression. The boots and the gloves should also have some spell suppression to get capped early on. One way of getting additional spell suppression is by anointing Quickstep, which would be pretty affordable, even on League Start. The chest and the helmet should be evasion and energy shield based to get enough energy shield for the Divine Blessing setup, and because these base types tend to be unpopular, decreasing the cost of the 6-linked chest and a +2 minion helmet later on. The other main difference in the low budget is a 6-linked rare bow. You can craft this one by using Shrieking Essences of Fear until you hit an acceptable flat added Fizz mod, so tier 4 or tier 5, and craft the increased physical damage modifier. If you get lucky and roll a decent increased physical damage mod, you can of course just craft the corresponding flat added physical damage, but this outcome is much less likely. In general, this should take you between 30 to 50 essences, which is why I recommend going with Shrieking and not Deafening Essences of Fear. If you ever come across double high tier flat added elemental or chaos damage, don't roll over it, instead try to sell the bow. Trust me, there will be a market for it. The flasks are a bit different from before. You still need a life flask that removes bleeding and corrupted blood, a granite, and a basalt flask for increased armor. And of course also a quicksilver flask that increases movement speed. But since this is an evasion-based build, you should also add a Jade Flask that increases evasion. For the jewels, you want Ghastly Eye jewels with flat added damage and attack speed, and an intuitive leap to save on some points here that you then invest into these life and mana nodes. For the Spectres, you want to use 2 Demon Harpies for the debuff. The AG should feature gear similar to the builds before, but uses the Oppressor to increase survivability against spells. And that's pretty much it for my League starters. If you have any questions or suggestions, you can leave them in the comments. I try to get to them as soon as I can. I will stream my League start with the Barma Necromancer on Twitch, and you can find my socials on my channel page on the description of this video. I hope you liked it. Until next time.